One of the leading candidates for the presidency of the Africa Development Bank is Nigeria's Dr. Akinwunmi Adesina. He is a distinguished technocrat with more than 25 years of international economic and financial experience in the United States, India, and across a number of African countries. He is currently Nigeria's Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development. Among other things, he's been credited with radically transforming the agricultural space, boosting GDP, and attracting billions of dollars in private sector investment commitments. Dr. Adesina is a bold reformer. Under his tenure, Nigeria ended 40 years of corruption in the fertilizer sector by developing and implementing an innovative electronic wallet system. The technology provides farmers with subsidized farm inputs using mobile phones. Within 4 years, the electronic wallet system has reached more than 14.5 million farmers. Under his leadership, Nigeria's food production expanded by 21 million metric tons, surpassing the 20 million metric tons target set at the start of his tenure just 4 years ago. Prior to his appointment as the Minister of Agriculture, he was the Vice President, Policy and Partnership at the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, where he led several policy and innovative finance initiatives. Dr. Adesina is a globally respected economist. He is a 2007 recipient of the prestigious Yara Prize in Oslo, Norway, and in 2013 he was appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, as one of 17 world leaders to galvanize international support for the Millennium Development Goals. In 2013, Dr. Adesina was voted Forbes Africa Person of the Year for his innovative reforms. CNBC Africa's Godfrey Ntwiza recently spoke with Dr. Adesina about his vision for Africa and his potential role at the helm of Africa's apex bank. Here's the interview.
It's a very special edition of Beyond Markets today. We are looking at the race for the African Development Bank presidency. It is a story I'm calling the African story of the year. Minister, thanks for your time.
It's good to have you.
Minister, do you speak French?
Oui, très bien.
It just caught me out. I thought you were going to say no, and then I had the next question. Now I'll have to rephrase my question and find out.
That's a good thing.
Part of the reason why I asked the question is because obviously language has been a big issue in the person who occupies the office of the President of the African Development Bank, because the French have always insisted that that person ought also to speak French, while also, of course, the English-speaking countries have asked for a candidate who speaks French. But do you feel that would be an impediment in the delivery of the mandate that you are bringing?
Well, let me just say that if you wanted to have this conversation in French, you should bring one trade prayer. No problem.
Not one word.
Okay, good. First and foremost, I think it's a very exciting thing, to be asked, to be put forward by my country to be Nigeria's candidate for the Africa Development Bank presidency. But I'm first and foremost an African. I have lived and worked in more than 15 African countries.
Wow.
Ranging all the way from 10 years in Francophone countries, from Niger to Mali to Burkina Faso. Worked in Burkina, to Guinea, and also in Ivory Coast and Cameroon, where I spent tremendous amount of years of work on the fields in working with everybody within those countries.
Sure.
I was the regional director for the Rockefeller Foundation for Southern Africa.
Right.
Your country is Zimbabwe.
Indeed.
And I was in charge of all of Southern Africa region, from Mozambique to Malawi to Mozambique.
Right.
And Zambia, all the other countries there. But also I was vice president working for Kofi Annan.
Right.
Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa,
AGRA,
where I work extensively all across Eastern African countries, from Kenya to Tanzania to Uganda to Rwanda and all of that. So I consider myself, first and foremost an African, and I am proudly African, and I'm at home in every part of Africa. I just happen to have been born in Nigeria, just like you were born in Zimbabwe, but I'm proudly African, and I'm at home in every part of Africa.
I absolutely get the thrust, Minister. Thanks for that. Let's get into what you are bringing to the African Development Bank. Now, you have been in charge of Nigeria's transformation in agriculture, and I think a lot of good things have been said about the work that you have done. But some are suggesting that you are still to realize the fruits of that work, and you are embarking on taking on another mission. Shouldn't you finish what you've started here before you embark on another one?
Well, I think first and foremost, I am delighted with what we have achieved in Nigeria, in the agricultural space. First and foremost, understand that agriculture is not just what people think about it. Agriculture is central to any economy in Africa. What Africa has going for it is agriculture, big time. Africa today spends, as you know, $35 billion importing food, and this is food that it can produce and it should produce, right. And Africa should be more competitive in global markets. But it is actually central to how you achieve fiscal and macroeconomic stability of countries, and also how you create jobs and inclusive growth, all of it is central right. to how we're going to get the African Development Bank and the Agenda 2063 actually working. What have we achieved in Nigeria? Well, first and foremost, I come from a big private sector experience. When I came in here in 2011, we decided that we were going to change agriculture from being a way of life. It's not a way of life. Agriculture is a business. And we did 4 things. First and foremost, we changed the perception of agriculture completely, to something driven by the private sector, that is driven by investments. And we began to take a look at value chains all the way from whatever you produce, whether you're in Mali or whether you are in Ivory Coast producing your cocoa, or you are, producing oil palm in Cameroon or any other country. You process and add value to the whole chain that you have. And finally, is to make sure that private investments accelerate within the space. Well, see what has happened with good policies and good reform and political will. Within the last 3.5 years, we expanded food production in this country by an additional 20 million metric tons of food. You take the financial markets, which I work on very, very strongly because I'm a development economist with broad experience in development finance and financial management. We've been able to grow the portfolio of banks in the agricultural sector of Nigeria from 0.7% of the total portfolio of banks when we started. So the end of last year was 5% of the total portfolio exposure of banks in this particular sector. I expect this year will be about 7.5% of the portfolio, and next year we're going to hit 10% of our portfolio. But you also look at what has happened in terms of foreign direct investment. We attracted $5.6 billion of private sector investments within 3.5 years into this place. And I set up a fund that is called the Fund for Finance in Agriculture in Nigeria. It's a private equity fund which is set up with the KfW, the largest development bank in the world, that provides access to long-term equity financing for small-scale businesses right here in Africa. It's a continuation of what I've done in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Mozambique, and in Ghana, helping their ministries of finance and ministries and central bank to actually develop risk-sharing instruments that today are leveraging over $4 billion on the balance sheet of banks into that particular sector. So all I'm saying is that we've done tremendously well in this place. And we look at our food import bill in Nigeria. It essentially went down from an all-time high of almost $6.9 billion to about $2.5 billion within 3 years. And that has given this economy strong fiscal and macroeconomic stability. So a lot has been done, and I bring my heart, my mind, my zeal, my passion to Africa, and I believe this is the time for me to serve. I always look at every position from the perspective of serving. I want to serve Africa with all of my mind, my soul. All the experience that I have, and that's what I bring to the table.
And what I'm also hearing is that I am bringing in private sector experience, I'm bringing in public sector experience to this job, and I am marrying all these and bringing a vision that combines the power of the money that we have in the private sector with the right regulation, bringing the best out of Africans. Okay, I get that, but we'll get to that. We'll get that. So as we're walking in, you were pressing send on your submission to the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank for your candidacy. What is your central message? What did you say to them that makes you stand out amongst the 8 candidates?
My vision is a very, very simple vision. It's to have first and foremost an Africa, that is very prosperous, an Africa where you have inclusive growth and shared prosperity. An Africa where, you have regionally integrated markets, an Africa that is connected to the rest of the world and therefore globally competitive, but an Africa that you have a lot of liberty, a lot of freedom, a lot of entrepreneurship, an Africa where our young people are very proud to call home, an Africa that we can really call ours. And that's the instrumentality of that, is to use the Africa Development Bank to use both its financial resources, but also its knowledge brokering capacity to be able to position Africa, to develop this kind of new Africa that we've been talking about. So obviously for me, I will build very strongly on what President Kaberuka is doing, and also in particular in the area of infrastructure. For me, the key that is very important about infrastructure here it's not just infrastructure, but infrastructure for what?
Right.
You know, my approach to infrastructure is to say, okay, we're going to do integrated infrastructure, smart infrastructure that allows us to look at the entire development landscape and ask the question, what are the development objectives that we want to pursue first? Yeah. And what kind of infrastructure and the consolidated infrastructure systems are needed, be it roads, be it in terms of water, be it in terms of ICT, be it in terms of railways, be it in terms of energy, that is required to do that in both urban and rural areas. So obviously infrastructure is a big component for me. And for me personally, I think energy, I would take energy as my most important thing. And the reason is very simple. Today, Africa generates only 147 gigawatts of power. Well, that's, you know, Geoffrey, is the same amount of power that is generated by Belgium, right? You know,
a little country in Europe.
A little country, you know, but very important country. And yet Africa needs to grow the size of its generating power, installed capacity, to roughly 740 gigawatts by 2040. So there's nothing more important than power. But the question is really, how do you do that power? Yeah. I'll put a lot of emphasis on that part of power with new ideas of how you do transnational power projects. And we take INGA project in DRC, we got that solved in a way that is socially, with social safeguards and environmental safeguards. Yeah. You can power 75% of Africa, but beyond that, you also need to look, and I will look at the whole issue of decentralized power, decomplexing the power value chain itself, and look at, you know, grid power, off-grid power, renewable energy. Today, Africa has over 50%, Geoffrey, of all the renewable energy in the world. Solar power, wind, you have geothermal, especially in the Rift Valley of, that we have, and all of that. But hydropower, Europe uses 85%. All of its hydropower resources. We use only 8% of our hydropower resources. So I will put a lot of emphasis on that. The key, however, in infrastructure is not just project development. Right. Well, you know, having facilities that allows you to do project preparation, project you know, development is very, very important. But the key is execution. Absolutely. We just have to execute. I am known for delivering results and delivering results at scale. So infrastructure is a key component. The other thing that I believe is very, very important for me, because I am able to work very effectively, public, private, and also global environment, which is where I actually did almost 25 years of my career working with multilateral and bilateral finance institutions to build broad partnerships. I think it's important for Africa to development bank to support the private sector, the private sector for wealth creation. That is absolutely critical because, and that private sector includes, you know, the small guys, you know, the SMEs which form today, about 50 million of them that are in Africa, but whose number one problem is access to finance, and in particular affordable finance. That's very critical. But it also needs skills, they need infrastructure. Power is a key component to support them. But also I will be looking at even financial markets. But look, I mean, we have today a situation where when the bank was set up to do two things essentially, which is to provide, you know, access to financing to support the public sector, but also to support the private sector. Yes. But the bank's private sector arm has been doing very well of late. You know, I'm excited that by 2005, you know, they've been able to deploy about $250 million US, but by 2013, that went up to 2.1 billion US dollars. But the critical thing is support SMEs, support a lot of financial intermediaries that can deliver financing to these SMEs to be able to have developmental impact. But also there's the financial market infrastructure itself. Right. You know, you look at the size of the equity markets, we need to deepen a lot of these markets, and the whole thing all around how you have your systems for payments, for reconciliations, settlements, you look at your credit ratings, you look at a financial market information system, and all of those things are very critical for Africa to build. So for me, private capital markets are key. The third area, of course, I will pay a lot of attention to, but even related to that question is industrialization. Because I really am a big believer that Africa must industrialize. And because our share of industrialization, global value added, is extremely low. We just can't do that.
Do we plan it though?
Sorry?
Do we plan it? Do we plan
yes, we will plan to use private sector to drive industrialization. Exactly, right. Because if you look at what has happened with other parts of the world and Africa, you take the global value added of Asia, for example, in terms of industrial manufacturing. Well, in 1980, they were roughly about 5.8%. But by last year, they were roughly about 34.9%. You look at Africa's share in 1980, it was, basically 1.9%. And in, last year, we were about 1.4%. So we need to actually get our private sector engine to drive industrial growth, and to process and add value and beneficiate, as people say, all the things that we have. But I also believe that a very critical component for us is jobs. Right. Listen, I mean, Jeffrey, you and I look at what has happened with jobs in Africa today. We have growth. It's great. But we have to make sure that the growth is inclusive growth and one that is creating quality jobs, and they can keep with the deluge of millions of young people that are coming out of schools. We have 13 million Africans that were from Tanzania to Uganda to Nigeria to Rwanda, from everywhere, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, every country, coming out of universities, but they can't really get the jobs. And so there's nothing more important than doing this. And if we don't do that, then we're going to really heighten economic, political, and social fragility of the continent that can derail all of the great work that the bank and everybody else has been doing over time. So I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on that. But obviously also is the whole rural economy. Right. Look, you're from Zimbabwe. I lived and worked in Zimbabwe for almost 4.5 years. And I traversed the entire area of Zimbabwe from Natural Resource Region 1 to 2, Natural Resource Region 3. And so I understand this space so well. And what I see is that you have a lot of, today, 60% of our population, almost 70% of our population in the rural space. Sure. But they're disconnected, Geoffrey, from the growth process. And so, but the way to create inclusive growth, which is central to the strategy of the bank, is to ensure that we get agriculture working not as a way of life, but as a business that is able to turn hundreds of millions of farmers whose livelihood depends on agriculture to create stupendous amount of wealth. And that's what we've done here in Nigeria. And I believe that that can be done because Africa should fill the world with what it has. And finally, it's very critical. I think what the Africa Development Bank is doing on regional integration is very exciting. Right. I think what the Africa Union is doing, the chairperson of the Africa Union, in pushing regional integration is important. You and I, when I travel, I want to be able to go anywhere in Africa with an African passport. True. I want to be able to. I raised the question at the last AfDB. I remember you with that. And at the same time, we have to make sure that we build the size of our regional market. Well, look, we are only trading 12% among ourselves, but we need to expand the size of that trade among ourselves. But that requires that we build infrastructure, transnational infrastructure. I am a person that is heavily biased towards small countries in terms of economic growth and development. That's where I did most of my work. I lived in a small village in Niger Republic in 1984 doing my PhD. So I understand we need to connect the countries that are in the coastal countries with infrastructure, rail systems, maritime services, and air transport services that will let Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Liberia, and all of these countries, and Chad and all the others that are landlocked to be able to get access to services. And so I see things such as the regional railway systems like is being built in East Africa to connect Rwanda to Burundi to Uganda and Tanzania all the way starting from Mombasa as a critical thing. But if I look at your country, talk about power, you look at Victoria Falls, you can actually get transnational power grids to go all the way from Zimbabwe, going all the way to Botswana and to Namibia with that grid. And so I am a big person about let's grow the size of the regional market, because as you grow the size of that regional market, our exposure to global commodity volatilities actually go down. Absolutely. We grow the size of our economy, we create a lot more jobs, and so we've got more resilient. And I think that these are some of the things that I want to do, but also, I realize that the bank has a great amount of talent. The bank has a lot of great staff, and they are passionate about development.
Concentration of PhDs in Africa.
Yeah. I am excited. I know the bank quite well, and what I want to do is bring my mode of working, which is to work with others. I'm a big person when it comes to partnerships. To bring my over 25 years of global experience in working with multilateral finance and bilateral institutions to expand the financial base for the bank. To help the bank to execute, to help the bank to deploy at scale, and to deploy it efficiently, and to make sure that this bank, because it's a great honor to inherit such a bank that you're building on the shoulders of a tremendous amount of presidents that have gone over time. Yeah. But we got to make sure now that the bank makes sure that development reaches the nooks and corners of every single part of Africa. Yeah. Look, as somebody who has lived and worked in over 15 countries in Africa, yeah, I will make sure, with the support of the board of directors, yeah, and the governors of the bank, that, and the staff, the great staff of the bank, yeah, that this bank delivers the development and the Africans see it as their own, yeah, as their own bank.
Absolutely. We have seen China in the last few days announcing that they are reducing their target for economic growth. We know, of course, China has been one of the main engines driving African economic growth. We know about the lower oil prices and what they are doing to African oil producers, but also what they are doing to African oil importers. When you come in, what policies, measures do you see yourself implementing in, number one, positioning the bank to help mitigate the impact of those two risks that I've mentioned, and of course many others that I've not talked about?
Well, first and foremost, let me say that, as president of the bank, one of the things that I will do, which comes just naturally to me because that's what I've done for almost over 25 years of my career, is to build very strong partnerships and ensure that Africa is able to broaden that partnerships. I think foreign direct investment is critical for Africa's growth. And you look at it today, the foreign direct investment in Africa is roughly about 56 billion US dollars, and that has grown for about almost 45 billion US dollars just about 2 years ago. Now, but China plays a very important role. China is Africa's largest trading partner today. And if you look at most of our economies, in fact, for the entire continent, you look at it in 2000, only 0.1% of the total GDP of Africa was used in terms of trading with China accounted for that. 0.2% of our total GDP growth, right? But by 2013, that is 0.5%. And so that tells you how big.
It's more than double.
Yeah, China has actually been. But you look at the actual values of trading between us and China, just 2000 was only $11 billion. Well, you look at it in 2013, 2014, it's between $110 to $150 billion. And so China has a great role to play in what happens to our economies. But this has always been largely driven by commodities. Yeah. And so, industrial metals in particular, as their own growth was really happening with, their industrial growth, but also infrastructure development and manufacturing capacity, they needed a lot of these minerals from here. So a lot of it has been oil and gas. A lot of it has been in terms of copper, other minerals that we have.
And frankly, in China's interest.
Yes. Well, the fact is that it has helped African countries to actually grow. Well, where that really gives you a challenge is that it's over-dependency on commodity prices, raw commodity prices, exports. That's where the challenge really is. I think today, if you look at the growth figures that are projected for China's economy, that China's economy will grow about 6.5 to 7.5%. Well, that's still actually a great growth, but not much lower than what the earlier projection was. So which means that as industrial capacity, you have excess industrial capacity in China. You also have, excess savings in China. And also because of the reduced industrial growth and manufacturing. In fact, as labor costs begin to rise and wages are rising, they're actually offshoring, taking most of those things actually out. Yeah. So you have that. I would probably break it down as follows, that there are countries that are actually highly exposed. Right. Those that are exporting raw commodities to China, yes. I would say like, Angola and DRC, Congo, South Africa, Zambia with copper and all of that. They're actually highly exposed with that. And so that will have implications in terms of fiscal and macroeconomic stability for those countries. Yeah. But there are also other countries that rely on China's foreign direct investment. Look, foreign direct investment of China is big in Africa. Of the total amount of $41 billion that China gives as foreign direct investment, 47% of it has been in Africa. So you can understand. So if you pick some of the other countries that are so dependent, South Africa is dependent on that, Angola is dependent on that, Zambia is dependent on that. So you will feel even Nigeria, my country, is dependent on that. So you will feel that impact in terms of the slowing growth process. Exactly. However, there are two other dimensions that we must not forget. And those dimensions are the fact that the economies that have actually relied more on regional markets are the ones that are actually more boisterous and less likely to face the downside risk of the slowdown in your growth. You take places like, Senegal, you take Uganda, you take Kenya, that have actually placed a lot more emphasis on regional markets. Yeah. These countries are less exposed. But if you take other economies like Ghana, that actually spend a lot of their exports to European Union, where maybe their exports account for, to EU accounts about 67%. Like Ghana is a good example of that. And even Botswana is a good example of that, and you find Namibia as well. You find that these economies are less likely to face a lot of the downside risk. And so what are the implications of this? First and foremost for Africa, from perspective of African Development Bank, I think first and foremost is that it's very crucial for African economies to diversify. We must diversify away from just relying on primary commodities because of the volatility in commodity prices that gives you these internal shocks from direct transmission into your domestic economy. Yeah. Second is that we must also build heavily on building regional markets. Look, we trade among ourselves very little. Only 12% of trade goes on between us as African countries.
Compare 70% with the Europeans.
You look at European Union, it's actually almost 80%. You look at NAFTA region, the North Africa Trade Agreement area, it's well over 45%. You look at the ASEAN countries, it's well over almost 50%. And so Africa needs to trade. We need to build a bigger market for ourselves in Africa. Okay. And thirdly is that I think we need to also build domestic markets themselves that actually allows us to grow, not just simply exporting, but in particular for me, if I am elected as president of Africa Development Bank, I will put a lot of emphasis in helping those countries that have the natural resources. I don't believe in the natural resource curse argument because, today Norway, has
it has that oil
for how many years? And so what really happens is how you manage it, for development. And so the whole issue of beneficiation, of adding value to every single thing we have in that market, it's very important. Not just exporting it. You can take your natural gas and turn it into ammonia and do all kinds of things. And finally, I think the most important thing that we also have to do is just build the skills. Look, for example, we don't even have the skills to process and add value to a lot of our minerals. I'm delighted with what Botswana is doing in Botswana with diamonds, with their collaboration with De Beers and all of that. That's a fantastic thing to do. We need to do more of that, build skills capacity and capacity for us to even know what we have. Today, we don't even know what we have. And so one of the things I would like to proceed with, to pursue, is to develop an Africa, natural resource map, which allows us to know what we have and what's the amount we have, and also to help countries from the advisory capacity from the bank to manage their natural resources better. So you can have sovereign wealth funds that allows you to cushion your exposure to volatilities like this. And so it's a comprehensive thing. I think the bank is well positioned to do that. But as somebody who believes a lot in integrated approach to things, I think we've got to help all of our countries, the small countries in particular, that are going to be so much exposed to it, have to be helped tremendously to further diversify their economy. And I will pay a lot of attention to those small countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And Minister, I can say it, you probably can't say it. And I would say break down those colonial boundaries. And I'll keep saying those colonial boundaries because I think there are times when we forget actually that they are not our boundaries, but these were boundaries imposed in Berlin, however many years ago. Let's talk, Minister, about the field that you are facing. It is a very strong field. 8 candidates that we're talking about. So when I was trying to think about who's going to be supporting you, et cetera, I was looking at it regionally, obviously, because this is something that traditionally the bank has looked at in terms of who occupies the office. So we look at East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, as well as North Africa and Central Africa. Now, when you look at the field, we've got 5 candidates coming out of West Africa. We've got a candidate from Southern Africa. We've got a candidate from East Africa. And we've got a candidate sort of from Central Africa, but really sort of West Africa more. When you rate your prospects, do you think you'll be able to overcome these other strong candidates, and on what basis? Well,
first and foremost, let me say that the very fact that you have a race in which very distinguished Africans participate is a fantastic thing. It just tells you how important this institution is. And everybody wants to really bring the whole mix of experiences that they have to make Africa better. That's the way I see it. And in particular, for me, it's what I bring to the table. I think is the fact that I know Africa very well. In fact, I only started working in Nigeria just 4 years ago when I was appointed by the president as minister here. But, whether it is from Tanzania to Uganda, whether it's to Rwanda, whether it's to Kenya, where I spent several years, to Malawi, where I helped the late president of Malawi tremendously in their work, whether it is working with central bank governors and financial ministers of finance from all the way from Uganda to Tanzania to Mozambique to Ghana over years to develop risk-sharing instruments to unlock capacity of their banks to lend significantly to the real sector, or whether it is in Mozambique or your country, Zimbabwe, or quand je le dis, si vous voulez parler de français, je peux dire bon. Let's leave that. No, what I was just trying to say, I'm just teasing you, is to Mali, to Niger, to Burkina Faso, Chad, and places where I have actually lived, worked, interacted tremendously. I bring to this a tremendous amount of knowledge and understanding. I bring to this global partnerships to help the bank to deepen its partnerships with the World Bank, the IFC, other multilateral institutions, including quite now recently the BRICS, which is the BRICS Bank, which is very important facility to have, but also that, and also the global the philanthropic institution. So I bring that, but more than that is the fact that I'm actually, I'm a development economist, and I believe that with my broader experience, which covers financial management, economic policy, as member of the economic policy group in Nigeria, the Economic Management Group, that's the highest decision-making body on policy management in the country. I have participated very actively in looking at economic investment and financial policies for the sector. Sectors that go all the way from ICT to housing to infrastructure to urban development to health, to education, to agriculture and extractive industry. So my experience is actually very, 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 very broad and very strong in this. And so I really think that with that, I believe that I will make a great president for the bank. I will build on what my friend Donald has done and other previous presidents like, look at Mr. Babacar Ndiaye, Umar Kabaj and all the others that have done great things at the bank. So that's what I bring, and more than anything else, is the fact that I want to serve Africa, and I've got a passion to do that.
I was teasing you earlier when I came in and saying that you're going to live your life in a suitcase for the next 2 months, but I'm sure you will be doing exactly that. Now, you obviously have been, you have done your maths, and you have targeted whoever you're targeting. When you look at the field, who do you think is your biggest rival?
Well, I think that is going to be an interesting race. But I do want to say something that, it's important to recognize that as Africans, Africa is my home. I'm at home everywhere in Africa. And, I look at the situation with Ebola, for example, and, I lost a lot of sleep in that situation because I knew how hard, President Salif Johnson was working. I knew how hard they were working also in Sierra Leone. I knew how hard they were working in Guinea to deal with that particular. In fact, I did work in Frerekoya in Guinea, where you've actually had the new situation that has occurred. I work in Bumpy River of region of Sierra Leone. So I know those areas very well. I feel that if given the chance as president of the bank, that these economies that are actually doing quite well before, but have been hit by this shock, need to have a greater, I will create a wider window or a fragile state window to allow them to cope with the impact of this shock, but also to allow them to make the critically needed social investments in their economies. And so, for me, honestly, I'm very pro small countries where I've lived and worked all my life. And I believe that the development of Africa, by the way, is more than just the big countries. I believe in building the small countries. I believe in expanding opportunities for them. That's the way things have to be. Under me, that's exactly what I will do.
So you can imagine, like a good reporter, I've been doing my homework and talking to people and trying to understand who's got the highest chances, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the issues that has come up is that some small countries actually feel that you don't need a big country to occupy the highest office in the development finance institution of the continent. Would that mitigate? Would that work against your son?
Well, the thing is,
from Nigeria, most populous country, biggest economy.
Well, let me
one of the fastest growing.
Well, let me just say to you, you get onto a plane.
Yeah.
And you're flying to Europe or flying to Mombasa or anything. You know, you just want a very good pilot, a very safe pilot. Yeah. You know, you don't go ask them whether they're from a small country or a very big country. You want a very smart person, somebody who actually has the passion, the vision, the commitment to drive and to work with the stakeholders of the bank to make it a more impactful bank that is efficient in delivering developmental impact. Yeah. As I have said to you, I'm an African. I am at home in every part of Africa. Nations are not the ones that run the bank. Yeah. It's individuals that run the bank and deliver value for their shareholders. And so I'm very encouraged and very excited by the excitement about my candidacy all across small countries to big countries. Yeah. And more than anything else, as president of the bank, people sometimes think that it's the president alone that runs the bank. No. Yeah. The president works with boards of governors of the bank, which is all the finance ministers and all the board of directors of the bank. They work with staff. So it's not about you. Yeah. It's about actually running an institution and running it and delivering it to have inclusive growth and development effectively all across the country.
I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure you will not answer anyway, but I have to ask the question. So you look at the regions that I spoke about earlier, and you'd imagine that East Africa will back Minister Sufyan from Ethiopia, and you'd imagine also that Southern Africa is going to back Mr. Sakala from Zimbabwe. But you would be scheming probably beyond that and thinking, in the first round, probably yes. What about the second round? Do you see yourself making the second round?
Absolutely, I believe so. I think
we support you in that scenario.
Well, I believe that, to get elected as president of the bank, you need to work effectively with all countries. And by the way, I do not separate countries based on who they support or who they do not support. Sure. As someone who's running for the office of president of the African Development Bank, even folks that don't vote for you, they are members of the bank. Sure. I've got to make sure that the Africa Development Bank works for them. I've got to make sure the Africa Development Fund works for them. And that will be what my role is. And all African countries are going to benefit. I will develop every single part of Africa. And that's my message, And when I go to countries, we are pitching the candidacy. We are talking to people, and we are making very great headways in that. I think you will find at the end of the day.
Are you visiting all 54?
well, let me just say that I've been on a whirlwind tour. It's going well. It's going to be very hectic. You said it that I have my bags packed. Actually, I'm living in a suitcase. But what better thing to do? It's a real high privilege to be given an opportunity to run a development bank like that, to create new hope aspirations for the continent, to build on what has been done. I'm excited about that. I think that when it comes to positions, I always look at positions this way, that they only matter not because of you occupying it, but because of what you do with it. Sure. In this particular case, to ensure inclusive growth, green growth for the continent, to work with our partners, the regional, don't forget your regional member countries, and you have non-regional member countries.
Coming to them
and
now.
Right, these are the shareholders of the bank, and the private sector and the civil society. They are very crucial, and that will be the task of a president of the bank.
Quickly, Minister, what are you pitching to the non-regionals? These are the donor countries, it's the EU, it's the Americans, it's the Japanese, it's the Asians.
You're asking me to give away all I'm going to say. You're digging her, okay. But let me just say that, I think that the bank is very fortunate to have actually opened up the bank to the non-regionals, because the non-regionals are actually a very significant part of the bank. And when you look at what Africa needs to develop, the fact of the matter is that the public side of the bank, of African Development Bank for a long time has gotten a lot of support. But today, if you look at what the trend has been more on the private sector. Right. You look at the sovereign wealth funds, you look at the pension fund growth, you look at the diaspora bonds and how they're going, you look at how the financial markets and capital markets are working, you look at the growth of private equity funds on the continent. So you come to a conclusion that in fact, we need to actually grow even the partners even broader. Right. And so that is how I look at the bank, and I think these are all the stakeholders that are going to matter Absolutely. In an election for the president of the bank.
We've got 5 minutes to go, and I need to talk about you and what you bring individually to the bank. Right. So I was talking about a couple of weeks ago to one of the think tanks that looks at development across Africa, Covington and Burlington, and I was talking to one of their analysts, and he was saying the bank needs a person with vision. it needs a visionary, a person who is able to build on the work that has been done by Donald Kaberuka, who has brought a lot of respect and credibility to the bank through sort of big thinking as well as addressing some of the management and micro issues that the bank was facing as he came in. As a leader, how will you achieve that?
Well, first and foremost, you know, the great thing with leaders is that you have to have a very clear vision. And I think I've tried in the shortest possible time to give you, I'm always a visionary. But I'm a visionary, you know, if you have vision and you don't deliver, that is a dream. That's not a vision, right? I have a great vision. I've always delivered. Execution is what matters. I will drive in working with the staff and building the capacity to deliver even greater value for the bank. You know, as I said, you know, Kaberuka is a dear friend of mine, and I have the greatest respect for him. Sure. You know, and I will build and consolidate on what he has done for this bank and take this bank to the next level in terms of what developmental impact should really be. My style of leadership is really actually leadership based on results. I think what matters at the end of the day is really results. You know, when you have people putting money into a bank, basically I have to make sure that I preserve the capital, you know, of the bank and actually maintain the AAA rating of the bank. And so the bank is actually quite a great bank. If you look at the liquidity of the bank, it's fantastic. Yeah. You know, Donald has done a fantastic, Dr. Kaberuka has done a fantastic job of that. If you look at it, it's now really about how do we deploy the capital and manage it better for developmental objectives, while at the same time making sure that that is done in a very effective manner. I also believe that one of the things that's going to be really critical in my own management style is that I believe in people. The greater asset of the bank, i.e. staff, you know, they're the ones that actually go around and fly around and, you know, go in very difficult areas to develop projects and bring into the Board of Governors for them to approve. Yeah. You know, I will actually build that, and I've done that in Nigeria. Look, I sit over, you know, I lead actually a group of over 15 complex institutions, parastatals in Nigeria, with a total staff strength of over 7,000 people. And we've been able to deliver this tremendous amount of value to Nigerians. And so what I bring is that I bring a very deep knowledge of the public sector, very great, because I'm a private sector by nature, you know, but also I've worked in global institutions, you know, and so able to bring all of that together to make sure that the bank can deliver value at scale, very well managed, focus on results, execute, and be seen as a bank with a heartthrob for Africa.
Well, you'll be very glad to know that from 7,000, if you get the job, you're probably managing about 1,500 or so.
Well, you know.
A little less than you are responsible for. But some people suggest that actually Donald has brought to the bank a presidential air, if you like, in terms of how he has conducted himself and also in terms of how he has conducted the affairs of the bank. But when we look at Mr. Adesina, when he was setting out as a young person with dreams and trying to get into the world and studying, did you always see this path to the AfDB?
Well, you know, actually I grew up out of rural areas. I grew out of poverty. And so I know poverty is not about statistics. You know, it's about real people. You know, I mean, I lived, you know, went to village school where we had to walk for several kilometers to go find water. You know, I used to be quite ill because of malaria. And so I know exactly what that means. I've taken bad water, and therefore I've had diarrhea, and I know the importance of actually doing that. You know, I've actually, you know, grew out of poor neighborhoods where we barely had, you know, good sanitary facilities, and I know what that means, that you need to also do that. And I might use that as a segue just to make a point here about the whole issue of urbanization in Africa today. You look at all across Africa, from Nairobi to even Lagos to many of our African countries all over, you have a lot of burgeoning cities, right? But they're bursting at the seams because a lot of them have nothing but just islands of wealth and oceans of poor people, you know, slums everywhere, you know. But if you look at how Africa is going to develop and actually grow in the future, we've got to make sure that we are able to provide water, sanitation, social housing, mortgage financing for people to have decent lives in the cities. Because if you don't have that, you cannot turn your cities into growth engines. And so one of the things that I see as very important is, as part of my integrated infrastructure, is integrated infrastructure to make our cities more resilient, make them actually climate resilient, more for green growth, but also areas that become productive engines. Because, you know, McKinsey's analysis shows that, you know, in the world, you're going to have only about 2,600 cities that are going to account for over 80% of GDP growth in the world. Right. In Africa, 24 big cities are going to account for 44% of GDP growth. So what we do with our cities, therefore, very, very important. I say this because I grew up out of poor neighborhoods, and I know the importance of water, sanitation, and so on. It's really comes down, Geoffrey, to giving hope to a new generation of a better Africa, a more inclusive Africa, an Africa where every African feels comfortable, not running over the Sahara Desert trying to get to Europe and therefore put pressure on their own social, economic, and social safety net systems, or trying to swim across the Mediterranean and die. No, that's not the kind of Africa we want. That's why I like what Dr. Zuma is doing at the African Union in terms of pushing this 2063 agenda. The Africa we want. The Africa we want is a place we can call home. In Africa, we want is a place where our young people can really see opportunities, a place where our private sector becomes more inclusive in driving growth, where SMEs have access to financing, and Africa where we can trade a lot among ourselves, where private capital, foreign direct investment is here. But what better institution to get to that Africa 2063? I can't think of a better one than the Africa Development Bank. And that's why, as somebody who has worked all across the continent, with all of my heart and passion and drive that I have, I will serve Africa with all of that.
I suspect that if I allow him to continue talking, we'll talk the whole night, and we'll continue talking about his vision for a prosperous Africa. That's the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development here in Nigeria. That's Mr. Adesina talking about his vision for the African Development Bank, should he be elected on May 28 as the next president of the bank. Thank you for watching. Make your own conclusions. Good night.
For more information about Dr. Akinwunmi Adesina, you may visit his website at www.adesinaforafdb.com.